So investigations are continuing into how coronavirus spread from one family quarantining in Sydney's Adina apartment hotel to another. It's still unclear whether leading COVID vaccines like Pfizer and AstraZeneca prevent the transmission of the virus, even in people who've received both doses. Professor Nancy Baxter is a clinical epidemiologist at the University of Melbourne, and she joins us now from Melbourne. Nancy Baxter, welcome. So the good news is no new local community cases in New South Wales in the 24 hours to 8 last night. That news has just come through. So that's in the wake of this hotel transmission detected over the weekend. So in this case in Sydney, the hotel workers had been given one dose of a vaccine, as we understand. Is there any evidence yet about any reduced likelihood of A, getting the virus, or B, passing it on once you've had one dose of a vaccine?
Yeah, so what we kind of base that on is not so much the ability to look at transmission itself, but how many people get infected. And that's both with symptoms and the ones, most importantly, the ones that get infected and don't have any symptoms. Because we know that from a symptomatic infection point of view and a serious infection point of view, the vaccines are very good. But what we didn't know from the trials is how good they were at preventing infections without any symptoms. So if you never get the infection, presumably you can't transmit it. So some of the most important recent studies have been looking at those people that get COVID but don't have any symptoms and whether vaccines prevent that. The best evidence we have of that is really from Israel. So Israel has had a mass vaccination campaign, probably has just about the highest for a country with a significant population, the highest proportion of their population that's been vaccinated. It's been with Pfizer, and they've been studying that pretty widely. After 2 doses of Pfizer, their chance of an asymptomatic infection, so an infection without any symptoms, you don't know that you had it, that's about 94% protection. So that's as good as preventing any infection. After 1 dose, it seems to be a little less good, but still very, very, very effective in terms of preventing any infection whatsoever.
And what about with other? We just don't know what the situation is with other vaccines yet.
Yeah, there's some evidence from the UK that included, their smorgasbord of vaccines, so predominantly AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and their rates are more like 54% prevention of asymptomatic infections. That was after 1 dose, so not after the 2 doses. Most people had only received 1 dose of vaccine. So I'm sure we'll be getting more data from there as well, but definitely some reduction. AstraZeneca has a lower effectiveness in terms of mild infections. So you'd expect there to potentially be more transmission. But it's important for people to remember, it's not just whether people get an infection or not, a mild infection or not, it's how infective they are. So I'm sure, as everyone has, heard, there are these super spreader events where one person can spread to a lot of people. They're more infective. They probably have more virus in their throat and their nose. And so they spread it more. And so what the vaccine may do is, even if you have an infection, there just may be less virus around, so it may be less transmissible. So just measuring the infections may not fully represent how effective these vaccines are in terms of preventing transmission.
Yeah, and so, you've just gone through a lot of information there. And so with if a person's had the 1 dose of a vaccine, then it probably does offer significant protection in terms of picking up an asymptomatic infection.
For sure, AstraZeneca. I mean, the evidence from Israel is good there. And the evidence from the UK, with that 54% reduction in asymptomatic infections, a lot of those people had only had 1 dose. It was a mix of AstraZeneca and Pfizer.
Yeah, because going into this, we'd heard when the vaccine rollout started, the caution was, look, this is not going to stop you getting the virus, but it's going to cut down the severity of the virus. But it seems to be the case that these vaccines are pretty effective at actually stopping you even getting the virus.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we were all hoping for. But, the trials didn't specifically look at that. They weren't designed to look at asymptomatic infections. So we couldn't be sure about that. And obviously with this disease, the precautionary principle is the most important thing. So we didn't want people to be vaccinated and without evidence, without proof, to be thinking that they were at no risk at all, because it might have been that it wouldn't reduce asymptomatic infections and they could still be infective. But what seems clear now, the emerging evidence, is that fortunately it does seem to prevent any type of infection.
Wow. And so is that giving experts a lot more confidence about the ability of the globe to get on top of this?
Well, hey, the thing that worries all of us right now isn't the effectiveness of the vaccine against the virus that we know now, because that seems to be, the vaccines we have seem to be very effective against the virus we know now. But the fact that this virus continues to be out of control around the world means that new variants are going to emerge. So the virus is going to change, these new variants will emerge, and the vaccine we see in 6 months or a year from now, if we continue to have this wide outbreak, is going to be different, and our vaccines may not be as effective against the new variants. That's why, unless we control COVID-19 everywhere, we won't have it under control anywhere.
Yeah, but is there confidence that you'll be able to adjust those existing vaccines to an extent and get on top and still get on top of it?
Yeah, well, the newer vaccine technology is being made so that it can rapidly adapt. I must say that from a forward-thinking point of view, that focusing on some of the vaccines that aren't related to, adenovirus probably is the way to go. Novavax may be an important contributor, but I think in Australia, developing mRNA technology, so the technology that's needed to make the Pfizer vaccine, the technology that's needed to make the Moderna vaccine, I think that needs to be a huge priority for the government. We may not be able to have enough of that type of vaccine to vaccinate everybody now, but almost certainly we'll need a booster of some sort later down the line, and it probably should be focused on not one of the adenovirus vaccines like AstraZeneca.
Why?
Well, AstraZeneca has a slightly lower effectiveness when we're looking at things like transmission. For some of the variants, it seems to have slightly lower effectiveness, although it still seems to be effective. A little bit harder to change the vaccine. And as well, we know there are these serious complications. So it's a good vaccine. It's a safe vaccine. The risks are low. And I think for right now, it's a more than adequate vaccine. But for the future, I think that that's not quite as, it's probably not the vaccine to go with for the future. For right now, it's really good. So I think that if we're looking towards the future, that technology, we don't snap our fingers and it just develops. So I think that we need to be looking at making sure Australia can make mRNA vaccines for the future.
Was it a significant oversight of Australian authorities not to get involved in mRNA production a lot earlier than they have?
Australia is not alone in that. And, it's not kind of simple technology. So like I said, it's not something you snap your fingers and you can have the production ready.
But it is something that could have been picked earlier?
Maybe, and maybe we would have, in a year instead of a year and a half, we would have had the production facilities in Australia. Novavax may end up, which isn't an mRNA vaccine, may end up proving to be, a major global winner as well.
Right.
So maybe that the Novavax is something that we move to. But I would predict that eventually we'll be moving away from the AstraZeneca vaccine to some other type of vaccine development. And it's not because it's not a good vaccine for right now. It's just if we're looking towards the future, probably not where we're going to go in the future. And so
could that have been analysed more effectively a little earlier? How do you feel about the Australian? Yeah, right. So how do you feel about the Australian authorities' approach to the vaccines overall in the last year or so?
What is truly a miracle, and I don't think that we realize how much of a miracle it is that we're having this conversation right now.
Right.
About which vaccine is better and which vaccine should we have picked amongst this array of vaccines that we have available to us. I mean, it is nothing short of a miracle that we now can be picky and choosy about our vaccines. So what I would say is the government had an array of vaccines. I think they were a little bit late to get a contract with Pfizer. But they did, and I think they also had a contract that allowed them to get more if they needed it. Could they have been more transparent about the fact that they could get more Pfizer if they needed it? Yes, I think they could have been more transparent. They probably would have been pushed towards getting more Pfizer if we had known that they had an option to do so. Why they weren't more transparent, I'm not sure. But it's good that they had an option. They were thinking ahead.
Yeah. Well, overall, Nancy Baxter, I feel a bit more optimistic about the general situation after having spoken to you this morning. So,
well, I'm optimistic for us, and I'm optimistic for us right now. Like, I think that in the last 3 months of this year, we have to have, military precision in terms of getting everyone that's not vaccinated vaccinated. You look at countries like United States, where they had this limping along vaccine program that just took off when they organized and when they were committed to it. When you look at Israel, when you look at the far-reaching communities, the northern communities in Canada, where they just had a very organized approach to vaccination, I really think that we're going to be able to do it, and we're going to be able to get the majority of us to have a single dose of vaccine before the end of the year. But I got to tell you, we got to control this everywhere. This is a global problem, and if we don't think of it globally, you look at what's happened in PNG.
yeah.
If we don't think about this globally, this is something that we're going to be is going to be consuming us for years and years and years.
Yeah. Okay, Nancy Baxter, so good to have a chat to you this morning. Thanks for talking to us from Melbourne.
You're welcome.